Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today and taking time to attend today's presentation. My name is Amy Jewitt, and I am the Invasive Species Coordinator at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. Normally, I'm based in the Pittsburgh office, but today I'm joining you from my home office because of the winter weather that we are getting today. So again, thanks so much for being here. I'm excited to have Sean Hartzell with us. He's with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. I'm going to introduce him here in a minute, but I just want to mention for our presentation today, which is titled Aquatic Invasive Critters, Non-Native Fishes, Invertebrates, and One Pesky Turtle. We do have a Q&A feature enabled, so if you'd like to ask any questions either during the presentation or at the end, you can do so by typing in your question. And then at the end of our training today, we will give some time for Sean to answer any questions that come in. So I do want to take a moment and just introduce Sean quickly. So Sean Hartzell is the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. He works in the agency's Division of Environmental Services and is based in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Sean received his BA in Biology and Natural History in 2015 from Bloomsburg University and a Master's of Science in Biology also from Bloomsburg University in 2017. Sean's work with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission focuses on collaborating both internally and with agency partners in various ways to mitigate the spread of aquatic invasive species within the Commonwealth. He serves as the agency's representative on the Pennsylvania Governor's Invasive Species Council, the Pennsylvania Controlled Plant and Noxious Weed Committee, and the Mid-Atlantic Panel for Aquatic Invasive Species. So welcome, Sean, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that introduction. I am so happy to be here. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I heard from Amy, we have a very, very high turnout today. So I'm super excited and super happy for all of your interest in this topic. So I love aquatic invasive species. I could talk for hours and hours and hours about them. Gonna try to keep things, limited today because I'm sure you folks have other things to do, but we're gonna go over a little bit about some of the critters that I work with, some of the nasty critters that I work with, their impacts and distribution. So I'll dive in. As I'm going through the presentation today, I am going to cut off my video just because sometimes I have some bandwidth issues. Just like Amy's working from home today, I am as well due to the weather. So I'll be turning that off while going through the presentation, but I'll turn that back on for the Q&A at the end of the session. So let me get situated here and we will dive in. All righty. So diving in today, let's see. Uh-oh, I'm not able to advance. There we go. Okay. So diving in today, I had first wanted to just really go over the basics of aquatic invasive species. So what are aquatic invasive species? Many of you folks tuning in may already be very familiar with the subject, but some folks maybe haven't heard some of these definitions. So I'll just throw a few quick terms at you before we advance and get into the good stuff. And so aquatic invasive species tie into exotic species or are a kind of a subset of exotic species. And this definition I have up here on the screen of an exotic species is kind of wordy. It's kind of a legally definition, if you will. It actually comes from the President's Office of the United States. I think this was put forth back in the late 90s. And so an exotic species is with respect to a particular ecosystem, any species, including its seeds, eggs, spores, or other biological material, capable of propagating that species that is not native to that ecosystem. What does this mean in plain English? Is just an exotic species is some sort of a organism or its reproductive material, eggs, spores, etc., that is not native or not naturally supposed to be in that ecosystem. It's there because of human influence. So next we go one step further and we'll define invasive species. So invasive species are exotic species, but they're a special category or class of exotic species whose introduction does or is likely to cause harm in one or more of the following categories. So invasive species are non-native, they're exotic species, but they cause either economic harm, environmental harm, and or harm to human health. And at least when we're talking about aquatic invasive species in Pennsylvania, primarily we're focusing on economic economic harm and environmental harm, and often these two factors are intertwined. And then, of course, today, my area of expertise, what I focus on in my position with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission are aquatic invasive species, and these are just invasive species that either live in the water or have some part of their life cycle in the water. And last but not least, a term that sometimes is a little bit tricky or confusing is naturalized species. So naturalized species are exotic species, but they are not typically considered invasive species, although a lot of these definitions really blur depending on the exact situation you're focusing on. But naturalized species are exotic species that have established in a particular ecosystem, have assimilated to some extent, and no longer cause or do not cause any major harm. So just because something is not native doesn't necessarily mean it's invasive. It becomes invasive again when we're causing harm in one of the categories that I talked about above. All right, so getting into the more fun stuff, I'll say, how do aquatic invasive species get around? So I'll be introducing you at least to a few of the critters that I work with in my position and focus on, but how do they spread around? The first is through bait bucket introductions. And so these are typically invasive or non-native bait fish and crayfish, things that are used as fish bait. And so on the bottom of the slide here, there's a bucket just absolutely full of crayfish. And so many crayfish species are non-native. When they're introduced into a new habitat, they can really spread. And so, either crayfish or fish, if somebody has them as bait, either purchases them or collects them to use as fishing bait, fishes with them, but then they have a couple leftover critters in their bait bucket. Surveys vary, but generally in the ballpark of 50 to 60% of anglers admit to dumping leftover bait, setting this free. And that's a big cause or a big pathway, I should say, for the spread of certain groups of aquatic invasive species. The next is through boat ballast or live well water. And so these are typically small organisms or microscopic organisms that are spread through water. So anything that's moist, either in fishing gear or a boat, like a live well that's not completely drained, ballast water that's not completely drained, etc., could potentially spread aquatic invasive species that happen to be in that water. Next is hitchhiking on uncleaned boats, fishing tackle, waders, etc. This is a really big one I focus on in my position. I have a great photograph on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see a boat propeller that's covered in an invasive plant called hydrilla. And even just a little scrap of hydrilla and certain other invasive plants as well, if they're spread to a new water body, can potentially found a new colony or population. So things hitchhiking can certainly spread as well if boats or fishing gear are not properly cleaned. Next up is illegal stalking and unwanted pet release. And I have a picture of a cute turtle on this screen. Unfortunately, this turtle is an aquatic invasive species in Pennsylvania. It's the red-eared slider. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But folks will either illegally or unlawfully stalk fish species where they want to establish a fishery. Maybe it's a sport fish that's invasive or could potentially be invasive. And it's stalked, for the idea behind it for the folks doing that stalking is for angler benefit. They want to establish a fishery, but it may cause some unintended consequences. We'll talk about that with northern snakehead here in just a couple minutes, or unwanted pet release. And so that red-eared slider turtle, you can purchase them at Petco. It's perfectly legal to have, but it is unlawful to release non-native reptiles and amphibians into the Commonwealth. Unfortunately, though, folks do. Those turtles, they live a long time, they get big, and they can get kind of cranky. But unfortunately, we have folks that dump their pets or a goldfish that gets too big or something into Commonwealth waters, and that could cause problems. Last but not least, I just wanted to note that once aquatic invasive species are introduced into an ecosystem, many of these organisms have a strong potential to spread on their own. They're pretty good movers once they have that initial introduction or that initial help from humans. And so I'm going to get into the heart of my presentation today, which is our rogues gallery, as I like to call it. And there are many, many introduced aquatic species in Pennsylvania, many non-native species. In Lake Erie alone, it's estimated there are almost 200. And there are others in inland waters as well. Now, fear not, I'm not going to go over all of these today. We certainly don't have time to go through all that. I'm just going to pick a few of the really big ones and from the zoological side of things, since I primarily focus on zoology in my position due to time. So I'll just talk about a few critters that are of high priority to the agency. And so the first species I'm going to talk about is the northern snakehead. So this is a fish species that's been in Pennsylvania for close to a couple decades now. It is prohibited, so it is a banned aquatic invasive species in Pennsylvania. It's illegal in Pennsylvania to possess live snakehead, to transport them, etc. And it's prohibited actually with all snakehead species. So snakehead are the northern snakehead. It's part of a species complex or part of a family of snakehead fish, which have approximately 20 to 30 species. But this is the prominent invasive snakehead species in North America. Many other species of snakehead are a little bit more tropical, but the northern snakehead can survive and persist in more temperate waters. This is the only one, at least currently known in Pennsylvania, currently known from Pennsylvania waters. This is a pretty big fish. So the maximum size is the maximum size was captured recently in North America. It was just shy of 20 pounds. This was in the Potomac River Basin in 2009, I believe, in Maryland. And it can get to be about 33 inches in length. Typically, they're not quite as big, but it's still a fairly large predatory fish. And so northern snakehead, the main concern with them is competition, and then also because of predators, predation on native species. So competition with other aquatic predators, with other predatory fish, and then also what they're potentially consuming. There's been some study on the northern snakehead. There's a good study that just came out in 2019 from Maryland, where researchers had data on a fish community prior to northern snakehead invasion in that community. Then after the snakehead established in that system, they compared the fish community. So they went out and sampled again. And they found that there was declines. Now, some of these declines were very moderate. In nearly every other fish species in the community. There are certainly changes that were attributed to northern snakehead. So very interesting study suggesting that they could potentially be impactful. And on the photo here, you can see northern snakehead. You can also see their teeth. This is quite a toothy fish. So how did they get here? So snakehead are, from my understanding, I haven't tried them myself, but supposedly delicious. And kind of a very meaty fish as well. So very popular as a food fish in their native range in Asia, and probably were initially introduced into the United States from food markets. These fish are long distance swimmers, and they are also prolific spawners. And so once introduced into an ecosystem, they're very, very good at moving and expanding, at least where they're not blocked by some sort of a barrier. And they also produce very large numbers of offspring. So very, very good, unfortunately, at establishing.
Hi,
More
Sean.
recent, hey, Amy.
Sorry to interrupt your presentation. There is some weird audio going on. I don't know if you hear it on your end. We can still hear you.
Okay.
It just is a little garbled a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to maybe sit closer to your mic or if that would help or anything like that, but just wanted to let you know there is a little bit of audio issue.
All righty, let me see if I can switch things up here.
Again, sorry to interrupt you.
All righty, is it a little bit better now?
Yes, that sounds better.
Okay.
You just sound a little far away, but I can still hear you.
All right.
Thank you.
So anyway, and thanks for letting me know about that too. I've got a couple mics here, so hopefully this one's a little better. So anyway, so northern snakehead initially were introduced into North America, probably from food markets and from trade. With more recent introductions, so there have been populations in Pennsylvania as well as in other parts of the United States that seem to have popped up in reservoirs where there's no or unlikely that it would have been no opportunity for the fish to naturally come up into those areas. And so it's probably attributed to illicit introductions by anglers. These fish, although they're invasive, they are fun to catch, and some folks really enjoy catching them. And so there's folks that potentially want to establish a fishery for northern snakehead or introduce that in this northern snakehead into a reservoir or into a water body in order to be able to catch that fish species. Unfortunately, though, the costs certainly outweigh the benefits of having a northern snakehead in the ecosystem due to their impact. So definitely not a good thing that's going on. And I'll just note too, northern snakehead, really ecologically, they overlap with largemouth and smallmouth bass. There have been a few studies that focused on this. They really consume similar prey species. Both are mainly piscivorous, consuming small fish. Um, and last but not least, northern snakehead do have some native lookalikes in Pennsylvania. So if you're on the lookout for northern snakehead, do be aware of our native lookalikes so that you do not confuse northern snakehead for those. So on the slide here on the right-hand side, I have a picture of a northern snakehead on the top. And then in the middle, we have a bowfin, which is a native species in Pennsylvania. Bowfin are primarily found in northwestern Pennsylvania, Presque Isle Bay, Lake Erie Basin, so on and so forth. But they look very, very similar to northern snakehead and often are confused by folks for northern snakehead. The main difference to tell, there's a few different characteristics, but if you look, and if you, hopefully you can see my cursor here, the bowfin has a short anal fin, whereas the northern snakehead has a very long single anal fin. So this is a really easy way to tell the difference. There's a few other characteristics as well. Bowfin will have a spot on the tail. Now this is only present in young bowfin and male bowfin. Females, once they mature, they lose that spot. So it's not 100% of a diagnostic characteristic. You can also look, the bowfin has a bony plate on the underside of the head. Another native fish species in Pennsylvania is the burbot, which is sometimes confused for a northern snakehead. They do look very, very similar to northern snakehead, and unfortunately that anal fin that the bowfin has, the short anal fin, is not a good characteristic for the bowfin. It looks very similar to the northern snakehead. Maybe a little bit hard to see just due to the size here of the screen. The burbot has a single barbel on the chin, kind of like a catfish. And northern snakehead do not have any whiskers or barbels or anything like that. So that's a really helpful diagnostic. The burbot also has two dorsal fins. You can see there's a very long dorsal fin that's then separated, and there's a small separate dorsal fin here, which the snakehead has a very, very long one. I should mention as well, burbot are typically found in northwestern Pennsylvania, Lake Erie. We do have some populations in the upper Susquehanna watershed that are considered endangered. So potential fish species that could be confused. So where are northern snakehead? Primarily northern snakehead are in southeastern Pennsylvania right here, the lower Delaware Basin. There are numerous records in recent years that have appeared in the middle Delaware. There's also actually records in the upper Delaware, New York, so they're kind of snaking their way up and down the Delaware. And then we also have a few populations that appear to have been introduced in reservoirs in the Delaware system as well. In addition to that, there's a couple reservoirs in the Susquehanna Basin that snakehead have been introduced into. And they're also very prevalent in the Chesapeake Bay area down in Maryland. Currently, their transport is blocked by several dams in the lower Susquehanna. Although snakehead were inadvertently passed, a few of them anyway were inadvertently passed in 2020 over one of those dams. So there was some effort to try to intercept some of those individuals. Now you'll notice there's also a record for Pittsburgh. Here, at least Pittsburgh is highlighted. There have actually been 2 captures in the Pittsburgh region of northern snakehead. It is not thought that there's any established populations there. These were likely single individuals that were kept illegally as pets or something like that and then introduced. So they have turned up elsewhere, but are not thought to be established anywhere outside of the eastern Pennsylvania region. So moving on to some other fish species here. I'm going to talk about both the round goby and the freshwater tube-nosed goby. These fishes are kind of similar in their size and impacts, really go hand in hand. So both of these gobies are small fish that were introduced into the Great Lakes Basin from ballast water. And so we had trade ships that were coming from the Middle East where gobies are native. that basically took in ballast water in the Middle East, and that ballast water had those gobies in. Then when they traveled to the Great Lakes region for trade, they took on cargo, and so they released that ballast water, and it's thought that the round goby were introduced and the tube-nosed goby were introduced by that pathway. More local spread, so to inland waters outside of the Great Lakes themselves, is thought to be by bait introduction, so folks collecting these fishes to use as bait because they're small fish, and also by larval drift. So both of these, or at least the round goby, when it lays eggs and produces offspring, those offspring are spread downstream if it's in flowing waters by the current. And so they can spread by that pathway kind of naturally or unaidedly as well. So both of these species feed on larval sport fishes. And they're thought, and there's some study that shows that they can displace small native fish. So they kind of bully the small native fish species, if you will, and compete with them. And there's been some recent study on round gobies that suggests that they consume native juvenile mussels. And so that's a big concern, especially in northwestern Pennsylvania and the French Creek Basin, where round goby unfortunately have been introduced. And that also has some of the best populations in PA of freshwater mussels, a lot of diversity there and some rare mussel species. So to tell the difference between these two different species of goby, the round gobies have a dorsal fin spot. So if you can see my cursor here, it's kind of got a bullseye on its dorsal fin. The tube-nosed goby really doesn't have that. It's not really as prominent in the tube-nosed goby. And the tube-nosed goby also has an apt name. And again, apologies, probably really hard just due to the tiny feature here and the resolution, but there's two tiny little whiskers, kind of tube-like structures coming off of the tube-nosed goby, which the round goby lacks. So that's a good way to tell the difference between these two species. Now, I get many calls and emails of folks who suspect that they have found a round goby or a tube-nosed goby in Pennsylvania. And in most cases, they found what is actually a native sculpin fish, which look very similar to both of these invasive goby fishes. And so the way to tell the difference between either a round goby or tube-nosed goby, they both have this feature, and a native sculpin fish, is to look at the pelvic fins. And so here's a photograph on the left-hand side of the screen of a round goby. It has a fused pelvic fin, so it kind of looks like a suction cup, almost like structure. You can also see this on the right-hand side of the screen. This fish on the top right here has those fused pelvic fins. And then moving down, this is a native sculpin, one of our sculpin species, the mottled sculpin. We have a few different sculpins in PA, but all of our native sculpins are going to have separate pelvic fins. So it's not fused together in a suction cup. They are split or separated and cut. So that's an easy way to tell the difference if you suspect you found either a round goby or tube-nosed goby, but you're not sure if it's a native sculpin, to check that out. I will note too that sculpins are found throughout the Commonwealth. They're a very common group of native fish species. So both the round goby and the tube-nosed goby are found in northwestern Pennsylvania. The tube-nosed goby is very limited in its distribution. There are just collections from Lake Erie itself, collections in Presque Isle Bay, and other places within Lake Erie itself. But as far as we know, they have not spread anywhere inland in Pennsylvania. Round gobies are known from Lake Erie, but they've also spread into inland waters. We have a few lakes in Erie County that have them. The Fairview gravel pits in Erie County have introductions of round gobies, presumably by bait bucket introductions. And Lake LaBeouf in Erie County also has an introduction of round gobies. This is especially concerning because Lake LaBeouf is in a French Creek drainage, like I mentioned before. And so this facilitated a pathway for the round goby to be introduced into French Creek itself, which is outside of the Erie Basin. It's in the Allegheny, Ohio River Basin. And that's of concern, again, because French Creek has some of the best populations of freshwater mussels in Pennsylvania. There are including a number of rare mussel species. Round goby eat baby native mussels. We don't really know how severe that impact will be, but it's certainly of concern. Probably one of the worst places they could have ended up in Pennsylvania, in my opinion, so not a good thing. So next I'll talk about the flathead catfish. So this is Kind of like the northern snakehead, another very large fish predator, consumes primarily other fish. And these guys are kind of an interesting case or circumstance because they're native to parts of Pennsylvania, but not native to other parts. So flathead catfish are native to the Mississippi and Gulf Coast drainages. And that includes Western Pennsylvania and the Allegheny, Ohio drainage. So we can say that they're Steelers fans. However, they've been relatively recently introduced in the Susquehanna and Delaware basins where they are not native. So it's an interesting case where we have a species that's native in one part of the state, but not native, and is considered an invasive species in another part of the state. This is a large fish. The state record is 57 pounds, and that was an individual that was captured in the Susquehanna drainage, where the flathead catfish is not native. And these are largely piscivorous. This is a fish-eating fish. It's a top predator in its ecosystem, primarily consuming other smaller fish species. They have a very large mouth. They're kind of like a vacuum cleaner, if you will, in the water that can suck up all kinds of prey. And some of our biologists that are focusing on and doing studies on the flathead catfish have found that they're able to consume pretty large prey items. Something even like a 10-inch bass could be consumed by a flathead catfish. So they can definitely, anything that they can fit in their mouth, they're going to try to take down. So there's studies ongoing right now in the Susquehanna Basin. One of my colleagues at the Fish and Boat Commission, Jeff Smith, is collaborating with Penn State University on some ongoing studies evaluating their impacts and other aspects of invasive flathead catfish in the Susquehanna Basin. It's speculated they may have impacts on game fish species, species of conservation concern, potentially rare species, and also migratory fish species, things like American shad. So there's some potential risks there that are just being evaluated at this time. And flathead catfish, similar to the northern snakehead, have been introduced illicitly. So they've been brought over and introduced into these areas where they're not native by folks that wanted to establish a fishery. But I would certainly argue that the cost outweighs the benefits. It may be a fun fish to catch, but it could potentially have some major impacts to that ecosystem. And they're also travelers. I mean, they can spread very far on their own once they're introduced into a river system. They certainly expand their population. So some quick tips on catfish identification. The channel catfish is on the top here. This is a common catfish throughout most of Pennsylvania. It's native to Western Pennsylvania like the flathead catfish. It's considered a naturalized species, has been here for a long time in Eastern and Central Pennsylvania. And channel catfish have a very deeply forked tail. So it's a large catfish species. Doesn't get quite as big as a flathead catfish, but still can be fairly large. But they have that deeply forked tail right here. Versus the flathead catfish in the middle right here has a flat, kind of a flat tail, squared tail, if you will. Doesn't have that really deep groove or fork in the tail. So that's an easy way to tell the difference between these two species. And then at the bottom, a very commonly confused species with the flathead catfish is the yellow bullhead. And we also have brown bullheads in Pennsylvania. Both yellow and brown bullheads are native throughout the state of Pennsylvania, very common in Commonwealth waters. They both look very similar to flathead catfish. I just put the yellow bullhead on here for comparison purposes. The brown bullhead really looks very similar to the yellow bullhead, but just has slightly different colored whiskers, more brown. So the way to tell the difference between a flathead catfish and a bullhead catfish is the flathead catfish, like, they're very aptly named, just like the tube-nosed goby, they have a very flat head, versus that bullhead catfish has a less compressed head. The other thing flathead catfish have, which is helpful for ID, is they have this protruding lower jaw, this kind of underbite going on here. That isn't seen in any other catfish species and can be very helpful for distinguishing them from a bullhead catfish like the yellow bullhead at the bottom of the screen. So the distribution of flathead catfish, I had mentioned that they are native to Western Pennsylvania. So this map, this shaded area and kind of the yellow or tan color just shows their approximate native range. And then we have records here where they are introduced in Eastern and Central Pennsylvania. So we can see flathead catfish are present in the Delaware River system in Eastern Pennsylvania, also going up the Schuylkill River. And then we have populations in the Susquehanna that have really well established in the lower Susquehanna basin. We've also found through recent surveys that they're beginning to get very prevalent in parts of the North Branch Susquehanna River Basin. Um, Fortunately, however, at this time, we really don't have any records from the West Branch Susquehanna River Basin, and there are very few records from the Juniata River Basin. Unfortunately, flathead catfish were detected for the first time just last year in Raystown Lake in Huntington County, and it's thought that that was an unlawful introduction by folks transporting that fish and introducing them. So next up, I'll move away from the fishes. I'll talk about invertebrates, and I'll just say I don't like invasive invertebrate species, but I am in part an invertebrate zoologist, so I do really love the critters without backbones. And these two species, the zebra mussel and the quagga mussel, are very majorly concerning aquatic invasive species in Pennsylvania, and I will say zebra mussels in particular are one of the primary aquatic invasive species I lose a lot of sleep over at night. So just like the round goby and tube-nosed goby, both of these species came to the Great Lakes from ballast water from trade ships, were introduced into the Great Lakes Basin, and they are easily spread to other waters by boaters. Both the zebra mussel and the quagga mussel produce microscopic offspring called veligers that swim around. They're kind of like a member of the plankton. Then they find a spot and settle and develop a shell. And so very easy for any water on a boat or fishing gear, anything that's not properly drained, to potentially spread these species. And in addition to that, they can attach to hard substance or hard structures. And so a boat may be fouled with zebra mussels if they're not cleaned off and it's taken to another water. And the zebra mussels are, survive. They don't dry out for a few days. They could potentially spread through that pathway as well. So both of these species, I say I lose a lot of sleep over them at night. And a big part of that is because they're very economically costly. Zebra mussels in particular cause millions of dollars annually in the United States in infrastructure damage. So zebra mussels like to attach to things. They actually produce small threads on their body, which cause them or facilitate them attaching to different structures. And they can clog industrial pipes, freshwater intake pipes, foul boats, foul docks. The shells will foul beaches, etc. And so, it just causes a ton of damage. A lot of these things have to be replaced. In addition to that, though, they're also very ecologically damaging. And so both of these species are major competitors of native mussel species. Zebra mussels and quagga mussels filter feed just like our native mussels, so they consume little particles, organic particles out of the water. And so they compete with our native mussels that way. And this also causes disruption of aquatic food webs. They're eating really the base of that food web, consuming all the good stuff at the base of a food web in large rivers and lakes. And so it's been demonstrated through numerous studies that they can have major impacts on the ecosystem by that. So for ID, zebra mussels are striped. They sit flat on their ventral side and are roughly the size of your thumbnail to thumb. So they're pretty tiny. That ventral side is really helpful for ID. I like to say that they're D-shaped. Now it's a D that's laying on its side basically, so they have that flat side. You can stand them up. And in contrast, a quagga mussel is more fan-shaped. It does not have that flat ventral side. It is not D-shaped, so it's a little bit more rounded. You can't really fully sit them up, so to speak, like that. Generally, too, they're a little bit larger on average than zebra mussels, so a little bit bigger of a critter as well. Still tiny, but bigger than a zebra mussel. Now here's just an example of a comparison with our native mussels. So we have all of these zebra mussels basically sitting right on top of that native mussel. They have attached through those threads I talked about, those byssal threads, and they're right on top of this poor native mussel. And so this is causing competition. They're eating all the food, all the good stuff in the water that the native mussel also needs to access, and causing some issues there. Zebra mussels also, they attach to something. They just hang out in one place their whole lives after they attach. Our native mussels, believe it or not, actually do make very slow movements. They stick out a muscular foot and can move around. It's very slow, but obviously these zebra mussels here are going to impede that movement as well. So a very good example of competition in this photograph. So where are they? Zebra mussels are, like I said, zebra mussels and quagga mussels were initially introduced into the Great Lakes Basin. Zebra mussels have spread pretty far outside of the Great Lakes Basin. So they've spread down throughout many parts of Western Pennsylvania. They're known from a number of lakes and river systems in Western Pennsylvania, probably spread primarily through boaters and boating. And then they've gotten to isolated areas in the Susquehanna drainage in central Pennsylvania. You can see there are a number of counties highlighted there. And in the Delaware drainage, they're only known from actually one quarry. So haven't really established there, but hopefully they don't spread further. The quagga mussel has a much more limited distribution, fortunately, than the zebra mussel does in PA. They are known from Lake Erie, just like the zebra mussel. And then a few other scattered locations in the Commonwealth. You can see those on the screen there at the bottom. And from my understanding, these are all quarries that they've been introduced to. So next up is a pretty infamous critter, something I've focused a lot of my time on. This is the rusty crayfish. And so rusty crayfish are not native to Pennsylvania, but many of the other aquatic invasive species I've talked about today, minus the flathead catfish, are from other countries, other parts of the world. The rusty crayfish is actually native to the Midwestern United States. So it is native to parts of Ohio, Tennessee, and other areas in the Midwestern United States, but is not native anywhere in Pennsylvania. So rusty crayfish came into Pennsylvania and spread via the bait trade. Rusty crayfish were introduced, at least first documented from PA waters in the 1970s and the Susquehanna Basin near Harrisburg. And back, many decades ago, rusty crayfish were very common in the bait trade. So they were sold throughout many parts of the United States in bait shops, made a pretty good bait crayfish, and they were desirable as bait because of their large size, which attracted fish. So spread by that pathway initially, and then through bait bucket introductions, folks collecting them and then releasing unused crayfish spread throughout various parts of Pennsylvania. Rusty crayfish are so bad because on average, they are larger than most native crayfish species, and they displace native crayfish species. It's well known in folks that study crayfish. When rusty crayfish are introduced into an ecosystem, many times the native crayfish almost completely disappear or completely disappear after rusty crayfish established. So they're really good at kicking out the natives, which is not a good thing. They also cause declines in other macroinvertebrate species, so prey on the other aquatic macroinvertebrates, snails, aquatic insects, etc. And they also majorly reduce aquatic vegetation. They really go through and mow down vegetation in an aquatic ecosystem. Also, they're pretty good predators of small or juvenile fish, very good at catching little fish as well, which is certainly concerning. So crayfish identification is really complex. My colleague Dave Lieb, who studies crayfish in the Fish and Boat Commission, could probably talk for hours about crayfish ID. But this isn't a silver bullet, I'll say, for rusty crayfish. But what's helpful is that rusty red spot that they usually have. Now, there are some populations of rusty crayfish that don't have the spot, or certain individuals. In some cases, it's reduced. And it gets tricky because rusty crayfish actually like to hybridize with a lot of other crayfish species in Pennsylvania. But looking for that rusty spot is a helpful diagnostic tip. And another helpful diagnostic tip for rusty crayfish is below. You can see the crayfish's mandibles or mouth parts. They're actually sideways in the crayfish. So they kind of come together a little bit differently than mouth parts of a vertebrate would. But these mouth parts are smooth. Hopefully you can see my cursor. These are the mouth parts right here. They are smooth. Other crayfish that look similar to the rusty crayfish in Pennsylvania have more jagged mouth parts. So these two characteristics, again, are helpful for rusty crayfish ID, but it does get a little bit more complicated. Where are rusty crayfish? Fortunately, rusty crayfish are not very prevalent as far as we know in Western Pennsylvania. They are in Lake Erie. They are in a few other locations like Pymatuming Reservoir in Crawford County. But rusty crayfish are very widespread in the Susquehanna River Basin. And I would actually expect some of these counties that don't have records currently for rusty crayfish, if folks were to go out and look really hard, they would probably find rusty crayfish in some of these areas. They're also becoming pretty well established in the Delaware Basin as well, in lower and upper Delaware, And again, I'm kind of suspecting if, if there's a little more effort looking for them, you'll probably find them in other parts of the Delaware as well. So really, really well established in eastern and central Pennsylvania. Not quite as well established, fortunately, yet in Western PA. So the last critter I'm going to talk to you folks about today is the red-eared slider. I had introduced this critter a little bit ago. Now, red-eared sliders are, commonly sold as pets. You could probably go to most pet stores and find red-eared sliders, and it is perfectly legal and perfectly fine to have a red-eared slider as a pet. It is unlawful, though, in the Pennsylvania Code to release any non-native reptile or amphibian into the Commonwealth. So fine to have them as a pet, not fine to let them go. That being said, though, unfortunately, it's thought that the main pathway of introduction for red-eared sliders is pet release. So like I mentioned before, folks will have them. They're cute little turtles. I actually had one of these when I was a kid. But they live a very long time, several decades. They can get very big, and they kind of get cranky and stinky when they get bigger. And so folks may want to get rid of them and, think they're doing a good thing by releasing the turtle into a local river or a local lake. And the turtle's very happy. Sliders are very good at adapting, but it's to the detriment of native turtle species in Pennsylvania. And so we have many records for red-eared sliders in PA. I'll show you a map in a little bit here. At least some of these populations are establishing. So, some populations may, or some records, I should say, may be individuals that are just hanging out, in the ecosystem, but they're not reproducing or anything. But we do have evidence that some populations are establishing where there's breeding going on, reproduction, etc. And this is of concern for native turtles in Pennsylvania, especially some of our rare native turtle species. The biggest concern that we're focused on in the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission is the state threatened northern red-bellied turtle. Northern red-bellied turtles are found primarily in southeastern Pennsylvania, really the greater Philadelphia area. And northern red-bellied turtles are similar in size to the red-eared slider. They do get a little larger than sliders, but there's some studies that have focused on that and have showed there's some degree of competition between these two species. So kind of concerning there. They also compete with other more common native turtle species. I've seen a red-eared slider actually multiple times where a red-eared slider will knock smaller native turtle species off of a log for basking. And it seems kind of funny, but turtles actually need to bask in order to digest their food, get rid of parasites, and perform other life functions. And so it's really excluding other turtles from that important resource. And again, I had mentioned this already, but regulations in PA, it's certainly fine to have a slider as a pet, but unlawful to release it. But the sad thing is we are seeing that folks are still doing that, unfortunately. So normally in my talks, if I'm talking to a small group or something, we kind of do like a red-eared slider ID quiz. I'm going to spill the beans and I'll say, as you guessed, the red-eared slider is right here. I've shown this picture a few times already, but I just wanted to talk very briefly about how to distinguish from at least a few of our other native turtle species if you're out, looking for red-eared sliders. So identification for red-eared sliders, we have in most cases this red stripe behind the eye, hence the name red-eared slider. And that's really helpful for ID, but I will say, just backtracking here, occasionally when these turtles get very old, they become very dark. It's called melanizing. It happens in certain species of reptiles, including red-eared sliders. And that stripe, that red stripe behind the eye may disappear. So it can get a little tricky, but in most cases, you should be able to see this stripe. Over here on the top right-hand side of the screen, I have a native painted turtle. And a native painted turtle does not have that stripe behind the eye. It just has yellow on its head. But it does have red on the kind of the margins here of its shell, some red on its neck, etc. Note that the red-eared slider has no redness whatsoever besides that stripe. So that's a little helpful there. I'll note painted turtles, they're found throughout the Commonwealth. We actually have a couple of subspecies, 2 subspecies in PA, as well as some hybridization for our painted turtles. That gets a little more complex than what I want to get into today. But looking for that redness should help for distinguishing. On the bottom here, on the bottom left is our state-threatened northern red-belly turtle. I actually sometimes called the northern red-bellied cooter. I think that's kind of the new common name that it was changed to relatively recently within the past few years. But again, red-bellied turtle is going to have that redness you can see on the margins of the shell that the red ear slider does not have. So looking for that redness is a helpful distinguishing factor. On the bottom right here, I have our northern map turtle. This turtle species is pretty common in some of our river systems. It's also found in Lake Erie, very, very common at Presque Isle Bay. We have no red whatsoever in the map turtle. So again, that red stripe in most cases works. Like I said, it's not a silver bullet for the red ear sliders if they get old and melanistic, but looking for that should be pretty helpful to distinguish from a map turtle. Map turtles also have they have a very hard shelly beak, especially if it's a large female map turtle. They primarily eat mollusks. So I've talked to folks before, I call this a mustache, or it kind of looks like they have a mustache. That's a little bit of a helpful feature too for identifying a map turtle compared to a slider. So where are the red-eared sliders in Pennsylvania? So this is a map from the Pennsylvania Amphibian and Reptile Survey, which is a project very similar in some ways to Pennsylvania iMapInvasives, but instead of tracking all invasive species in Pennsylvania, it is tracking all reptile and amphibian species. And there's community scientists, community biologists that are submitting data to this project as well, just like PA, IMAP. Some of you folks tuning in may be familiar with the PA Reptile and Amphibian Survey. But anyway, this map, I think it's great because it not only shows the county distribution, but it also shows kind of a heat map, if you will, for where the largest number of records for red-eared sliders are in the Commonwealth. So we can see red-eared sliders are pretty well distributed throughout various parts of Pennsylvania. These green counties have just a few records. So there may be established populations, there may not be in some of these areas. But we can see where the map really turns dark, gets redder, and then even purple in some cases, where we have a lot of records of sliders, happen to be concentrated near major cities where there's a lot of people, high densities of folks, and so probably more folks that are introducing sliders into Commonwealth waters just because there's more people and more pets. So you can see really in southeastern PA, the greater Philadelphia area, Harrisburg and York to some extent as well, Lancaster have a lot of records. Also, Center County, State College does as well. Pittsburgh does as well. And then going up to Erie, there's a few records there as well. So really kind of most of these major city areas in Pennsylvania tend to have a lot of records. So I'll wrap up here and trying to keep for time, and I may go a little over. I hope that's all right. But I just wanted to talk about, since I talked about these critters, now I wanted to talk about how you can search for them as a Pennsylvania iMapInvasive volunteer, as a community biologist volunteer. And so for a lot of these species, myself, my colleagues, other folks, professionals that are working on them, use a whole suite of different survey methods for searching for invasive species. But very often this kind of work requires specific skills and expensive gear. So I was out, not this year, but in 2021, a couple times with some colleagues from Fish and Boat and partners from academic institutions, doing surveys for round goby in northwestern PA. And we were actually using a boat. We had sophisticated electrofishing equipment, stuff like that. But there are also easier ways to look for some of these critters as well. And so, I'm sure most of you folks don't have a nice electrofishing boat in your garage, but there's easier ways to look for these as well, and it can give us some really great data. And I really love community biologist work like Pennsylvania iMapInvasives. Very often members of the public are the first folks to really detect or recognize new introduction or new record of an aquatic invasive species in Pennsylvania. We just have limited staff in Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission and other agencies. So a lot of times it's folks that are out fishing or out just looking around, boating, that notice something and let us know, submit records to Pennsylvania iMapInvasives or other pathways that really kind of detect those first. So I really strongly encourage community science and community biology like Pennsylvania iMapInvasives program. And so, for northern snakehead and flathead catfish, myself or other biologists for surveys, we'll be using electrofishing and other kind of sophisticated equipment. But both of these fish, invasive fish species, they can actually just be caught by rod and reel. So, an easy way to look for them as a community biologist is just to go fishing. I don't have any great pictures of fish or of folks fishing for these specific species of fish, but from talking to anglers and just having a little bit of knowledge of fishing for these species myself, definitely heavy, since these are large, both of these are large fishes, definitely heavier rod and reel, heavier line, medium to heavy. And northern snakehead, typically the habitats they occupy are shallow backwater areas or the margins of lakes. They really like shallow, weedy areas. And so, using stuff like a topwater lure, a weedless jig, or live bait, live minnows tend to work really well for capturing northern snakehead. So if you're out fishing and, you'll certainly have some luck with other species such as bass using these techniques. But if you're interested in kind of doing an unofficial survey for snakehead in your area, see if you catch them, these techniques tend to work. And one of the best things that I've heard, at least from talking to anglers who fish for northern snakehead, is a topwater frog. So I've got a photograph of that on the bottom of the slide here. Folks who fish for bass are probably very familiar with this type of bait already. It just mimics a frog on the surface of the water. It's a floating bait. Because snakehead really like weedy areas, it's kind of hard to get jigs sometimes or other things that are in the water column to them. So fishing this on the top of the water over the weeds is typically a successful method for trying to capture northern snakehead. And then flathead catfish on the other side of the coin, they tend to really like live bait. These are large predators, and so folks will use live bluegill or potentially smaller catfish species to fish for flathead catfish. And I'll say, both of these with the caveat that if you are fishing and you happen to catch either one of these species, make sure first that you know how to identify it, review some of the identification information I talked about earlier in this presentation, but we strongly encourage, because both of these are invasive species, to keep that, not to release it, to keep that and report it as well. So, take the fish home, eat it. Both of these make a great meal. And, flathead catfish too, with the caveat, we're encouraging take in central and eastern Pennsylvania, Susquehanna and Delaware, where they're not native. Of course, you can take flathead catfish in western PA as well. I believe the creel limit for catfish, including flathead catfish, is 50 per day. So, take them anywhere, but especially for the flathead catfish where they're not native. Next up, I just wanted to quickly review glassing for turtles. So if you're a bird watcher, it's the same principle, just going out to a lake, a river, especially backwaters, areas with low flow, if you're not at a lake or reservoir, bringing some binoculars and just really quietly looking for turtles. Any time of the day is good, but typically, these turtles are going to come out and do a lot of their basking in the morning when it's a little bit cooler out. They're trying to, the water, I should say, is a little bit cooler. They're trying to absorb that and warm up for a day of foraging and feeding and swimming around. And so going someplace in the morning and looking through binoculars for turtles is a great way to get familiar with native turtle species and turtle ID, and also to be on the lookout for red-eared sliders and identify those and report them to iMapInvasives or through other reporting sites as well. So we can help track those introductions in Pennsylvania. And so we've got some turtles that are basking on this structure right here. This is a good photo. Do have, a few turtle species in here, but you can see here's this big red-eared slider. A little hard to see with the glare and just the resolution of the photo, but we have that stripe right here. And this is actually another slider right here as well. It looks like there's a couple actually. So last but not least, kind of another fun way, kind of for the crayfish or the gobies that I talked about earlier, is using minnow traps. So again, folks have, like a professional biologist has sort of more advanced gear for this, but these are also really effective ways, and even professionals will use minnow traps to survey for crayfish or non-native small fishes like bait fish. And so you can purchase these fairly inexpensively. I think it's in the ballpark of maybe $20 or so at most outdoor shops. I have a photograph on the screen of a commercial minnow trap, or not commercial, but a minnow trap that you could buy like in a bait shop that's pre-made or something like that. So these are things that are put out in the water, typically overnight for a period of time. They are baited, so there's bait that goes in them. And basically the principle is the crayfish or the small fish will crawl into the funnel right here. They get into the trap looking for that bait, and then they're not able to figure out how to get back out that hole. There is some studies that have focused on these. There is some, escape that happens, but it is a pretty effective method for capturing small organisms like crayfish or bait fish. So I'll just note that this method, in addition to the fishing, which I talked about earlier, requires a fishing license in Pennsylvania, and there are some regulations that we have dealing with traps and leaving unattended traps. You need to have your name and address on them. I believe the phone number as well. And there's more information in the PA summary book. So I would refer to you to check out that if you're interested in trying some of this stuff out. Also, make sure to tie them to something on the bank so they don't flow away or get lost. We don't want litter in Commonwealth waters. And something else, here's a good picture of it, that I think is really neat. And I haven't tried this myself, but there's some great videos online I would encourage you to check out. You can actually make a homemade trap using like a 2-liter soda bottle or something. So you can see here at the picture on the bottom of the screen, somebody's taken a 2-liter soda bottle. They've cut the top off and then inverted it, placed it in there. And I would recommend to fasten this with tape, something that'll hold it on, but you can easily take off because the organisms will get inside of the bottle. It's also recommended to put a rock or something inside the bottle because it kind of helps it weigh down or keeps it stable when it's placed into the water column. And then punching like a small hole or something in the side where you can tie a rope or something, just to make sure that these don't get lost is also very helpful. But I think it seems like kind of a fun project, and maybe especially making the do-it-yourself minnow traps would be kind of a fun activity you could do with kids or something like that. Seems kind of fun to me. So again, there's lots of great videos. If you just go to YouTube and type homemade minnow trap or something, you'll find out some details on how to make those. And then finally, bait is wet or dry cat food, dog food. Some folks use chunks of hot dogs, bread, etc. All kinds of different things work. At least in my experience, I've done some professional work for crayfish and around gobies using minnow traps. And I think wet cat food tended to work the best for the crayfish. For the round gobies, I think they tended to be interested in hot dogs. Chunks of hot dogs seem to work pretty well. So just one final note before we dive into hopefully a little bit of time here for question and answer. But I just wanted to mention, while you're out there, whether you're doing surveys as part of the iMapInvasive program for aquatic invasive species, or just out enjoying Commonwealth resources, fishing or boating, etc., make sure that you clean your gear to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. And so PA iMapInvasives has some really great information on cleaning your gear. Fish and Boat, we have a webpage dedicated to that as well with that information. And Pennsylvania Sea Grant also has great information on cleaning gear, as well as just general info on aquatic invasive species on their website. And I would also encourage you, I'd love to talk for hours and hours. I want to keep this shorter so we can get into the Q&A, but all of these websites, in addition to information on cleaning your gear, also have a lot more information just in general on aquatic invasive species, critters that I talked about, other critters, and aquatic plants in Pennsylvania that are of concern as invasive species, etc. So I would really encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, check out these websites. And with that, I think we can dive into questions. I have my contact info here. And again, if there's a question you think of later that we can't talk about today, feel free to reach out to me, or if you lose my info, feel free to reach out to Amy for questions as well. And I'll dive back in.
Okay, thank you so much, Sean. That was really informative. It's clear that you are very comfortable speaking on this topic, and you have a lot of knowledge to share with folks. So thank you so much for taking the time to do your presentation today. We do have several questions that came through while you were presenting, so I'll go through them one by one in the order that they came in. So the first question is from Jeff. He's asking, is there a way to fish for just invasives and not catch natives? So is there a particular bait or techniques to use? And I think you touched a little bit on that, but maybe if you want to reference that again, that'd be helpful for him.
Yeah, so unfortunately, if you're going out and fishing on rod and reel or something like that, there isn't really anything that I know of where you could specifically select just for invasive fish species. Um, because, fish species like the flathead catfish, northern snakehead I talked about are more generalistic predators. They really try to eat, any kind of little smaller fish or critter that they opportunistically can find. You would also potentially capture native or naturalized sport fish species while you're fishing, such as largemouth, smallmouth bass. You could also catch what we call as biologists sausage, so things like pickerel or pike, kind of big, long, toothy fish that are either native or naturalized, depending where you are. And so, yeah, not really any good way to sort of separate those two, but I would encourage you anyway just to go out and check it out and see what you find, and you'll have a lot of fun doing it too.
Okay, great. Thank you. We had a question from Jim. He's asking, what are some of the programs planned or in place to reduce the northern snakehead population in the Delaware River Basin?
So the big thing, at least that the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission has been doing, is really encouraging take of the northern snakehead by anglers. And we've been a little cautious about this because you don't want to over encourage take as well, because there are folks that like them so much they may want to introduce them elsewhere. So really our big thing is kind of like what I've just been talking about with the previous question as well. It's just going out, fishing. If you happen to catch a northern snakehead or another invasive aquatic fish, don't release it, if at all possible. Take it home, enjoy it, especially northern snakehead. I've heard that they're excellent eating. So that's the main thing, in terms of like control. Um, there have also been some discussions about fish passage. This is really more so in the Susquehanna rather than the Delaware, but folks in the agency, and I haven't been closely involved with this, it's been other staff members, are talking about managing fish passage strategies that will prevent passage of aquatic invasive species, but will allow native fish, migratory fish species to pass. So that's another one. We also actually have a what we call an aquatic invasive species control plan for the northern snakehead, which is in draft form right now. So it's being worked on by the agency, but that will be coming out sometime this year. Hopefully sooner than later. And I'll mention too, we have plans for other aquatic invasive species that are already completed that are on our website that you can check out. But that snakehead plan is forthcoming. We'll lay out more specific strategies for focusing on the northern snakehead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sean. When you were talking about the zebra and quagga mussels, this question came through. Elise is asking specifically, how do these mussels impact the food web?
Yeah, so it's for both of them. That phytoplankton, zooplankton as well. Those little tiny microscopic critters or really tiny critters and just kind of organic particles and things like that in the water, they're taking that food base away from other organisms. And it causes direct impacts like competition, like I mentioned with native mussels, but also causes some indirect impacts as well. There's an interesting study actually on zebra mussels that showed that because of stealing that base of the food web, they actually brought large predatory fish like walleye, which is an important sport fish, down a trophic level. What that means in English is it actually made the walleye smaller, which was, not a good thing. So they're doing that, and one of the most pronounced impacts, and if you're live in northwestern Pennsylvania or by the Great Lakes, you've probably seen this. The zebra mussels have cleared Lake Erie. So Lake Erie, prior to their introduction, was very kind of murky. Now you can see, in some cases, pretty far down to the bottom in Lake Erie. And although it's nice to be able to see things, that's not good because they've taken all that food out of the water column. And so it causes, potential impacts from that. And again, I could send, if there's interest, some of these studies that I'm referencing and things like that, if there's interest.
Yeah, Sean, feel free to send that information over. When I send out the recording for this training, I can include some of those resources as well. Okay, very good. Elise had another question. She wanted to know, can you identify rusty crayfish versus natives at the larval stage?
Um, so very, very tricky with rusty crayfish. And terminology, so not quite, I would say, a larva. So crayfish, they have a very interesting life history where the female crayfish will actually carry the eggs under her abdomen. Then the babies hatch and they actually hang out on top of mom or hang out with mom for a little bit. They kind of ride along for about 2 weeks. And then they disperse into the water column and start molting and growing. Typically, the tinier the crayfish, the harder it is to identify. So if it was a really, really teeny tiny crayfish that just kind of escaped mom or something, um, I think typically folks may go and look at genetic techniques or be looking at characteristics underneath a microscope or something like that. So may get a little bit too technical, I would say, at least for like a community biologist audience to look at. But as they get bigger, both for professional biologists and for other folks, the easier they get to identify.
Okay, and that makes sense. Great. Thank you, Sean. We had a question from Rachel. She said, I work in streams frequently. Can you describe your recommendations for disinfecting and decontaminating gear between water bodies?
Sure. So there's a couple general options that work really, really well for most aquatic invasive species. My personal preference, so as part of my job, I'm going out in different streams and things like that all the time. Um, I freeze most of my gear, at least gear that I'm able to freeze. So waders, things like that, go right in the freezer. Freezing things for at least 5 to 6 hours. So typically what I do is I just throw things in overnight, then I have to thaw them out in the morning. That kills pretty much anything. And then usually what I do, considering pathogens and things like that as well, is I'll clean with a 10% bleach solution for those. But you can actually take it even easier, and in some cases I do this as well with gear, is actually just drying things completely. So letting things in an environment where the humidity is relatively low, like a garage, something like that, just letting things sit and completely drying for at least 5 days is really effective at killing almost all aquatic invasive species. So those are really kind of the two easy approaches that I recommend. The other one is you can also kill things with hot water. Now, hot water is sometimes kind of destructive towards gear, and the water's got to be warm. It has to be at least 140 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to soak things for a while. Or you could take a step above and steam clean if you have access to that equipment. Again, though, there's kind of that trade-off with damaging. But really kind of those three sort of easy pathways are very effective at most things. Just because it's easy for me and I'm blessed with a huge freezer in my office, I like to freeze things.
There you go. Great, thank you. There's someone that asked, are the invasive mussels and crayfish edible by humans?
Um, so kind of. um, for the zebra mussels and the quagga mussels, there's some regulations we have in Pennsylvania that prohibit collecting any mussel species for consumption. And I think the main rationale, at least from my understanding, and this may be better for fish and boats law enforcement to address, but at least from my understanding, it's because they can be confused with native mussels. Many of our native mussels are rare species. Some are listed as threatened or endangered. So we wouldn't want folks accidentally eating rare mussels or anything like that. But I would strongly recommend against eating zebra mussels or quagga mussels, regardless of the regulations, just because of the health aspect. Zebra mussels and quagga mussels accumulate a lot of kind of nasty things in the water. And actually, some scientists use zebra mussels, they'll harvest them and test their tissues for toxins and contaminants. So it's something that's not really healthy, in addition to not being unlawful or not being lawful in Pennsylvania. For the crayfish, you can eat them. At least from my understanding, there aren't any concerns with contaminants. Now, crayfish, we do have specific regulations with those, but they can be harvested for consumption purposes. Measures have to be taken to prevent their escape, so you need to make sure you're killing the crayfish on site or putting them in a container or something that prevents their escape. And then you kind of boil them like a little lobster or something like that and eat their tails. So yes, you can eat them. I think there's a little bit of work involved in the preparation, and typically the crayfish we have in Pennsylvania, at least even the rusty crayfish, which is kind of large, it doesn't really yield very much meat, so to speak. So could be a lot of work for not very much food at the end of it. But I would say yes for the crayfish, no for the mussels, in
Okay,
short.
good summary. And I just want to mention for folks that are still on the webinar, which we do have several, lot of people, we do have a lot more questions that came through. So I do want to make sure that we're giving time to those questions. So if folks need to drop off, that's fine. This will be recorded, the whole thing. So, and I'll be sending that out a little bit later. If you need to drop off, you can always watch it at your leisure. So Sean, we'll keep going. We have several more questions that came through. Amy asked, we do creek studies where I work and usually find crayfish, but they're usually quite small. Is the rusty spot visible in young crayfish?
So it is visible typically in smaller individuals, but if they're very young, like if they just left mom, it's a crayfish that's probably smaller than your pinky nail. It typically, at least in my experience, is not visible. But if it's smaller size crayfish that you're catching, it's kind of free in the water. You could potentially see that. Again, though, the caveat is in some cases the rusty spot is either very reduced in some rusty crayfish populations I'm familiar with, or it may not be there at all. And there's also a lot of variation among individuals. So good thing to look for, but again, not. I kind of put it out there as an ID, a helpful tool for ID, but not necessarily a silver bullet. And again, it goes back to the other question. It's, it tends to be the bigger the crayfish get, the easier they are to ID.
Okay, sounds good. We had a question from Kristen. She said, have there been any documented cases of disease transmission from non-native turtles to native populations?
Yeah, so there's a few cases in the literature. We don't have specific evidence of that in Pennsylvania. It's just not something that we really have had much capacity to assess. But I would recommend I mentioned the agency's working on Northern Snakehead Control Plan. We actually just put out a few months ago a red-eared slider control plan, which is on the website. And so that has some information on disease transfer outside of Pennsylvania and some of those references. So I would encourage you to check that out for more info.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sean. We had questions from Laura come in. I'll ask the first one and then the second one separately. So she said, how do you properly get rid of a pet turtle? Do you go to a pet store, or is there something else that you can do to get rid of a turtle that you no longer want as a pet?
So that's, pet turtles, it is tough getting rid of them. What I would recommend is surrendering them to some sort of a rescue. There's a few rescues in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania Sea Grant has actually a little bit of funding, and they've had some pet surrender programs. So I'd encourage you to get in touch with them for more information. But they've had a few events where they've worked with pet sanctuaries in order to have folks surrender unwanted red-eared slider turtles, as well as unwanted goldfish and things like that, rather than discourage release in the Commonwealth and help folks. So that's the first thing I would encourage. You could also try to find somebody else to adopt it, maybe a friend, family member, etc. And the other one is, something that is a little bit of a hard subject to talk about, but potentially humane euthanasia as well, going to a vet and going through that sort of process. Obviously, the other options, surrendering, are much better, but that's an option as well.
Okay, thank you. And Laura's other question was, should you kill red-eared sliders found in local waterways?
Yeah, so I don't like killing things, but the first thing I would say is make sure that you are 100% confident that it is a red-eared slider. Just because there can be some confusion with our native turtle species, and we certainly don't, want our native turtle species to be killed, especially something that may be a conservation concern like a red-bellied turtle. But if you're very confident that it is a red-eared slider, I recommend to remove it from that ecosystem if possible. If you want to euthanize the animal in a humane way if possible, certainly that's an option. Or I've talked to some folks who, they go out, they find a red-eared slider, they're able to capture it, somebody released it in their local lake, they're able to catch the turtle. And then they either keep the turtle as a pet, or they find a home for it or surrender it, give it to like an adoption center or something like that. So those are pathways as well.
Okay, very good. And Amy had a few comments, so not questions, but I'll just mention them here. When you were talking about the PA amphibian and reptile survey, the PARS map, she just mentioned as an aside, there is a project for PARS that you can link to in your iNaturalist account. So if any folks that are on here that are users of the iNaturalist platform, there is a project for PARS in there, and also iMapInvasives too, which she mentioned. So you can link your observations to both of those projects. Okay, and then we just had a comment, or more of a compliment from Dennis. He said, "Thank you as always for such great and helpful presentations."
Thank
And
you.
a question from Kel, similar to what we just answered. What do you do when you find a red-eared slider in a waterway? So Sean, you did just answer that. Kel also asked, are giant snails a problem in Pennsylvania?
So giant snails, that could it could potentially be a number of different snail species we're talking about. My presumption, anyway, from what you mentioned is you're probably thinking about mystery snails. So there's at least two species in Pennsylvania. The predominant ones are the Chinese mystery snail and Japanese mystery snail. Both are aquatic. They get to be very large sizes, something that you can hold in your hand and is pretty hefty. So they are species that are spreading in various parts of Pennsylvania. It's thought potentially that aquarium release or something may be contributing to their spread. And I would actually recommend, there was a very awesome IMAP webinar about invasive snail species last month, where some folks talked about both those species in detail. So checking that out for more information.
Yep, you took the words right out of my mouth, Sean. I was going to say, if there is anyone that wants a link to that recording that doesn't already have it for the invasive snail presentation, I'm happy to share that out. So just reach out to me. We had someone mention, if people are making traps large enough for turtles, like the hoop trap that was featured in one of your slides, Sean, please caution them to leave airspace for the turtles. They shouldn't sink completely underwater.
Yes, so that is a good point. So at least the minnow traps that I mentioned, those have very, very small openings, typically about 1 inch in diameter. So that's just going to be sampling for small crayfish or bait fish, something that would typically exclude a turtle. However, there are, as was mentioned by the submitter, large traps that could be used. These are typically very expensive or hard to put together, so typically more so used by professionals rather than community biologists. But yes, definitely, and I've done some turtle work, at least in past work that I've done, where we've actually put, when we're doing turtle trapping or work for turtles, put bottles full of air, like old 2-liter bottles, in those traps in order to basically create some airspace at the top so the turtle can come up and breathe.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Sean. We had someone mention very good presentation, learned a lot. Curious if Chinese mystery snails pose any significant threat to Pennsylvania's waters, and what strategies exist, if any, to actively reduce populations of invasive aquatic invertebrates.
So for the Chinese mystery snails, I'll refer to some extent to the previous presentation, IMAP webinar presentation. I will say, that the folks that gave that presentation, they did a fantastic job, and they're working on mystery snails and really assessing their impacts in PA. So yeah, at least from my standpoint, we don't have really great conclusive data that they're a major threat in Pennsylvania, but they are certainly still considered an invasive species. And I'm forgetting the second half of the question, if you could remind me.
Sure, I'll read it again. And they said, what strategies exist, if any, to actively reduce populations of invasive aquatic invertebrates?
So it's really tough, especially with the invasive aquatic invertebrates. Typically, if we're talking like, control methods like chemical control, because many aquatic invertebrates are very, very hardy, those chemical control methods are both incredibly costly, but also incredibly damaging to non-target species. And so Due to both of those factors, that's typically an approach that we haven't focused on very much in Pennsylvania. Really, the main focus for aquatic invertebrates that are invasive, such as zebra mussels, crayfish, is prevention, and that's through education. Telling folks to not spread them around, to clean their gear, and then also through regulation. For instance, there's regulations with crayfish that came out in 2015 that restrict them as bait. So crayfish any live crayfish, regardless of the species, can no longer be sold in a bait shop. If you're using crayfish as bait, if you collect them and go anywhere besides the water from which it was taken from that site, you need to remove the head of the crayfish. So it still can be used as bait, but will not be alive and could potentially spread. So really, it's more of a preventative approach for these organisms.
Okay, great, thank you. Don asked, what is the native habitat of the red-eared slider?
So red-eared sliders are, and I neglected to mention where they're native to. So they are from the United States. They're a southern species in the United States. So just kind of going down south, like Georgia, etc., is where they're native. And so their native habitat more or less is fairly similar to PA, just a little bit warmer. But they seem to, for better or worse, have adapted to our climate pretty well and are able to still reproduce here.
Okay, great, thank you. Laura asked, what is the current best practice for keeping boaters and fishermen from inadvertently moving AIS from one waterway to another?
Yeah, so best practice is just having folks be really cognizant about cleaning their gear and encouraging them to do so. And I would again recommend those web links I had at the end of my presentation. Just due to time, I couldn't really focus too much on cleaning gear just because I wanted to focus on other topics today. But really just having folks all be on board with making sure they clean their gear, making sure that they clean their boats. And some of the strategies I talked about a little bit earlier, either drying things for a period of time, freezing things if you can, and that's like waders, kind of smaller gear, things that are practical to do so. And then cleaning with hot water are really good strategies for all of those. So again, I'd encourage you to look into that more.
Okay, very good. We had a just a note, not a question, from Blyden. He said, I'm probably not going to pronounce the name of this water body correctly. The Conowdowingit in Western Cumberland County near Newburgh has areas where there are thousands of rusty crayfish in relatively small areas. From that, I would assume rusties are also in the northern Franklin County parts of the Conowdowingit. I don't know if you know anything about that or not, Sean.
Amy, would you be able to repeat the last of that? You cut out for a second there.
Yeah, sure. So this person is saying that from what I would assume, rusties are also in the northern Franklin County parts of the Conowdowingit.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. The rusty crayfish, kind of the ground zero, so to speak, in Pennsylvania. At least the earliest record that we have of rusty crayfish was from the early 70s in the Susquehanna River near Harrisburg. So the Conowdowingit was probably colonized a very long time ago with rusty crayfish. I've been in there myself, actually surveying for other aquatic invasive species, but noted rusty crayfish were just everywhere in the Conowdowingit. So I would definitely expect them to potentially go further into that kind of sub basin, and would encourage, if you're interested, to check it out and see if they've kind of spilled over into Franklin County as well, and check for records there.
Okay, very good. We had a question from Mark, and you sort of answered part of this already, but there's another part that I don't think we've talked about yet. He's asking what to do if you capture a red-eared slider turtle or a rusty crayfish. So you talked about the turtle already, but I don't think we talked about the crayfish.
So rusty crayfish, if you capture it, if you're confident that it's a rusty crayfish, and again, ID can be tricky, but if you're confident, and really for both of these, I've talked about what to do with the organism, but also, we very, very much strongly encourage reporting. Take some photographs, get the location, report to PA, iMapInvasives. That's an important piece I glazed over earlier. But with the rusty crayfish, it's a little different from the slider in that it wouldn't be something that could be kept as a pet or anything like that. So not something you could surrender. I would recommend eliminating or euthanizing the organism if you're comfortable doing so. And so when I'm doing field work, every time I encounter rusty crayfish, I document it. But then I actually either remove the organism's head, or it's not pretty, but I'll smash them with my boot. And I'll also note that crayfish, they're actually fairly resilient. They can survive some damage. So one of my colleagues had recommended to the public, turn them into paste, just smash them completely as much as you can, or the head removal will certainly work as well.
Okay. We had a question from Norris. He's asking, what are some of the best ways to practice and encourage participation in water sport, craft, equipment hygiene?
So, I mean, really, from my perspective anyway, it's just outreach, spreading that message. We have, at least Fish and Boat Commission or accesses, we have signs that in the past, we had partnered with Pennsylvania Sea Grant to produce these signs that tell folks how to clean their gear, whether it's fishing gear or boating gear, and it just lists kind of simple steps in order to do that. So the information is there, but it's really just kind of encouraging folks to do that. And I would say a little bit of a peer pressure kind of thing too. There's been some interesting survey results that are ongoing in Pennsylvania, and the vast majority of anglers and boaters report that they actually do clean their gear. So if you're not cleaning your gear, you're, kind of one of few. It's just kind of like wearing a seatbelt in a car or putting on a life jacket when you get on a boat. It should just be something we adopt as kind of a best practice for ecological stewards and protecting our ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. We had a question from someone. They said, are local restaurants interested in preparing snakehead to produce a market, and would it require FDA involvement? And also they're asking about any potential with food banks.
Yeah, so at least in Pennsylvania, we haven't really taken those steps yet or investigated that. I don't think we're quite at that point yet as a management strategy, but it has been done in other states where snakehead populations are much more prevalent throughout. So getting down into Maryland and actually Washington, D.C., I know there's some programs where folks have been commercially harvesting northern snakehead with certain permits that are issued locally. I don't know FDA wise what goes into that or anything. That's a little outside of my area of expertise, but it has been used, I guess I'll say, as a strategy elsewhere. And then in terms of the food banks, so I'd mentioned in my talk the Conowingo Dam, which is located in Maryland, and that's currently a major barrier preventing the upstream dispersal of snakehead in the Susquehanna River Basin. And so in the past couple of years, folks that have been intercepting the fish, crossing the dam, allowing the native fish or migratory fish or naturalized fish species to pass, but have been intercepting snakehead and other aquatic invasive species. They've actually collected and then donated at least some of that material to local food banks. So it is a strategy, not something we've quite focused on yet in Pennsylvania, but it is certainly something I think is interesting.
Yeah, definitely agreed. We had a question from Riza. She's asking, what state agency handles the aquatic plant invasives like hydrilla?
So it's kind of, things get a little complicated in Pennsylvania with jurisdictions because we have different splits and state agencies and things like that that are a little atypical for some other states. And so, especially with aquatic plants, there's shared jurisdiction for those. So for something like hydrilla, hydrilla is considered a Class A noxious weed in Pennsylvania by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's Controlled Plant and Noxious Weed Program. So regulation in terms of it being a Class A noxious weed, it's banned for sale, things like that. There's regulation there from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. There's also work on hydrilla in state parks by DCNR. So DCNR, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, is the lead on the hydrilla at Pymatuming Reservoir, for example. Fish and Boat Commission just really kind of putting our feelers out for aquatic plants. We don't really have much of a capacity right now for active management, so herbicide treatments, et cetera, things like that. But we're mostly working on strategies to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive plants like hydrilla, as well as other aquatic invasive species through education. But we also actually have funding in hand for at least a few aquatic invasive species disposal boxes, which is based off of what DCNR has done at Pymatuming, where folks can have basically a compost area where they can clean off their boat if there's hydrilla fragments or something else, put that there. So kind of a complex answer to your question, maybe not answering it too well, but there's a lot of different overlap, and it really kind of depends on the situation, where it is and what's going on for something like hydrilla, as well as other aquatic invasive species.
Okay, very good. I think you answered it as best you can, Sean. We had a question from Steve. He says, have the laws regarding the bait trade been tightened to reduce the introduction of aquatic invasive species?
I would say yes, to some extent. So there are certain aquatic invasive species that are, I guess the term that I typically use, or legal folks will use, is blacklisted in Pennsylvania. So they're listed in state regulations as species that are banned. They cannot be possessed, sold, at least live. Individuals cannot be possessed, sold, transported, etc. And so those would be species like the round goby, the tube-nosed goby. There's also a few organisms that I didn't talk about today, just due to the sake of time. But we have a complex of species called invasive carp, and sometimes juvenile invasive carp may be used as bait. So those are regulated, and those regulations have been around for some time. In 2015, Fish and Boat updated our regulations for crayfish. So formerly just the rusty crayfish was blacklisted or banned in Pennsylvania. This was expanded to regulations that encompassed all crayfish species, just because in addition to rusty crayfish, pretty much any crayfish species could be invasive if it's transported into a different area where it does not naturally occur. Crayfish are pretty dangerous potentially. So there is that kind of regulation. There's also joint oversight over bait dealers through the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. Fish and Boat, we provide guidance documents to the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture when they're issuing permits, or registrations, I should say, for those dealers. But in addition to all that, Fish and Boat Commission is currently focused on a revision of our Pennsylvania code related to aquatic invasive species, as well as other topics like aquatic pathogens and fish stocking. So it's a revision that's been proposed. It was in public comment in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. Currently, we're kind of digesting all those comments that we received from the public and working on moving that forward. But there is some language in there that's proposed to help regulate bait introductions a little bit more. So I'd encourage you to check that out.
Okay, very good, Sean. We had a question from Mark. He's asking, can the northern snakehead move and survive outside of water?
So it can, or I would say it can to some extent, more than most other fish species. So northern snakehead are kind of interesting, I'll say, in that they are air breathers. They actually swim to the surface of the water column. They can gulp air and subsist on that. So they can survive in very low oxygen environments, low oxygen aquatic environments, but also survive outside of the water for some period of time, as long as the fish is kept in conditions where it doesn't overheat, it doesn't dry out, etc. So they can survive outside of water. There are other species of snakehead in the family that can actually move around fairly well on land. So there's been some, I think even like a kind of a low budget horror movie where there was Frankenfish that were based on snakehead crawling around and attacking people and stuff. The northern snakehead, though, because it gets pretty large and it's heavy bodied, adults can't really disperse on land very well. Juveniles can move around a little bit on land, but it's not considered a major pathway. They're not going to get up like a turtle and walk half a mile or something to another water body. So it's not capable of that, but it is capable of surviving, at least for a limited period of time outside of water. More so than if I would take a bass or something out of the water, or a trout. It just wouldn't make it very long at all.
Okay, thank you, Sean. We do have a few more questions, so hopefully you can hang in there. A lot of people have some really great things they're out there wondering about. We had a question from Leah. She asked, are there any control plans in place for species like zebra mussels and mystery snails besides preventing their spread?
So for at least for the control plan, like an official document or anything, Fish and Boat recently put together a control plan for zebra mussels and quagga mussels, which is available on the website. So I'd encourage you to check that out. But kind of like I said earlier, in terms of like actual control, like going in, getting rid of these organisms, the capacity, at least in terms of like chemical pesticide treatments, trying to get rid of them, are just enormously expensive, unfortunately, and also have pretty major non-target effects. So it's not a strategy we've really been focusing on, at least at this time in Pennsylvania.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Sean. So we had a comment from Holly. She says, the catch trap for the crayfish reminds me of my youth when the boys would slowly lift the rocks in the creek so as not to disturb the silt to capture crayfish for fishing. I was afraid to get pinched by their claws. So a boy tried to show me it wouldn't hurt and he screamed out loud when one clammed on his finger. So a little touch of humor there to put here at the very end. We do have, let's see, I think we have some repeat questions. So I'm just trying to make sure I get to any new ones. So someone was asking, how do you humanely euthanize a red-eared slider turtle?
Yeah, so basically, it would have to be something that would have to either be done by a trained professional, like a veterinarian. There's some chemicals that are used, so it's typically an injection of different chemicals. The one that I'm familiar with is called MS-222. And I'm not sure offhand what the kind of more plain English term would be for that chemical, but it's something that's used by professionals actually as an anesthesia for fish, if you're doing work with fish or reptiles and amphibians. But basically the turtle is injected with that and it's kind of an overdose. So the turtle just kind of falls asleep. There are some older references that have recommended freezing, so just putting the turtle in a freezer, but that's actually not, at least more recently, considered humane. It seems like at least some studies have looked at this, and the animal goes through a lot of pain as that process is happening, so that's no longer considered humane. So I would recommend, rather than trying to attempt something yourself, going to a veterinarian or some sort of other professional for that sort of process.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that, Sean. Let's see, there's a question. Has any progress been made on a bacterial or a biological control for zebra mussels?
Not that I'm familiar with. I know there's been some focus on that and some papers that came out evaluating that. At least when I sort of last left the subject, there hadn't been any majorly conclusive results, or anything encouraging, I should say. So nothing I'm aware of, but it's something I'd be very interested in if we find something that acts a little more like a silver bullet.
Okay, thank you. And we just have one or two more things here and then we'll be wrapping up. We did have someone, Rebecca Kunfer. She said, I'm interested in hosting an in-person educational program and would love for Sean or another representative of the PA Fish and Boat Commission to contact me for details. So Rebecca, Sean's information was there in the PowerPoint today, although I'm happy to connect both of you guys so you can talk a little bit afterwards. And then we just had another comment to say, please clean and drain within a watershed before leaving a site. We need cleaning stations. And that is it. We had lots and lots of questions that came in. So again, thanks for everyone's interest in today's presentation. And thank you, Sean, for sharing your expertise and your time. I know we did go a lot over, but hey, it was all worth it, right? So again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to thank you, Amy, for setting this up and the invitation. This was awesome. And I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in today. We had a very high number of participants, and thank you so much for your interest in this. And again, any questions, follow up with Amy or I.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.